What's up, class? It's Professor Calderon. Week 3. You guys are knocking this out. Okay, so what I want to talk about is the introduction to sound. Okay, I'm coming straight from the book, class book, World Cinema. To understand the impact of sound, it should not be forgotten that silent cinema was not silent at all. Silent films had plenty of references to all kinds of sounds. They deliberately put the viewer in the position of a listener. Moreover, these films were presented in a cinema with live music performed by a pianist or an orchestra, and often the musicians would add sound effects to the action on the screen. So with film, there was already this idea of integrating sound with it somehow. Um, Now you have inventors who are seeking to sync the sound to the picture. Okay, that hadn't been developed yet. Sorry, adjust my tripod here. Okay, so the conversion to sound did not depend completely on technology, nor would its effects be restricted to technological matters. Software, not hardware, would become the deciding factor of the innovation process in the USA as well as in Europe, although this was not immediately obvious. Hollywood took its first step of conversion in 1926-1927 season, when Warner Brothers and Fox Film began wiring. They began wiring their theaters for sound. Warner's main intention was to offer cinema a substitute for live performers in their program, in particular the cinema orchestra and the stage show. So they were trying to get rid of they were trying to sync the sound to the film, but get rid of the orchestra and the stage show. The real breakthrough came through the 1927-28 season, when Warner released a second featured film, this time with lip sync recordings of songs as well as some dialogues, and that film is The Jazz Singer. The success of The Jazz Singer proved that sound could come off well if presented in a full-fledged featured film. So as soon as this happened, other studios jumped on board and they started doing films where they synced the dialogue as well as the music to the actual image. And this would save them a lot of money because now they didn't need the orchestra. If you don't have to pay an orchestra for every show and all you have is a film, then that saves a lot of money. Unfortunately, it put a lot of people out of work, the musicians and the orchestras and whatnot. But by 1930, most American cinemas had been wired for sound, and Hollywood stopped making silent films. So by 1930, the silent film was done, and most of the theaters were wired for sound. By 1928, after examination of different sound techniques, all the studios adopted the Western Electric sound on film system. This meant the imminent end of Warner Brothers Vitaphone Productions on disc. So the sound was incorporated into the film as opposed to a disc that would sync the sound. Outside of the USA, in the 1920s, there was to be found some interest in sound on film. European inventors like Berglund in Sweden and Triurgen Trio in Germany, or Peterson Paulson in Denmark, have been experimenting for years with sound on film technology. They had given demonstrations of their inventions in the early 1920s, but the European film industry showed little interest. So that shows you Europe was not on the bandwagon. The arrival of American sound films provoked reaction from electronic companies in Europe, who immediately began reorganizing resistance. In 1929, Tobis and Kleinman Film agreed to form a cartel with the aim of fighting off the American invasion and bringing the European film industry under its control. They used patent lawsuits to slow down their opponents while taking advantage of language barriers. So now that you have talking film, this brings up an issue of language barriers. Our talking films at this time were recorded in English. What if your film is opening in a country where they don't speak English? So now we have this language barrier issue coming up that is cropped up. Oh, right here on page 213 at the top. The struggle for industry control alone was enough to rock the foundations of the international film world, but this instability was increased by the language barrier. A silent picture could be exhibited in all countries of the world. A talking picture, however, became the prisoner of its own language. There you have it. Moving on. The future looked gloomy for American studios in 1929 through 1932. And not only because the economic depression had broken out at the same time, sound had unleashed forces that undermined Hollywood's international leading role. Exports stagnated not only because of language barriers and patent disputes around abroad, but also because Western Electric's policies did not square with Hollywood's. The European market at this time was taking advantage of this disintegration that was going on in Hollywood, particularly Tobis Clang Film and the cartel that we mentioned earlier. Okay, in 1932, there was a major breakthrough in solving the language problem. This is when dubbing was introduced, where they would... I was going to try and remimic it. Well, dubbing was introduced, and the standard method of translating talking pictures into major language while subtitling became the solution for minor language regions. The dubbing technique had taken 4 years to develop. In 1933 and thereafter, the Hollywood companies would recover from the initial setback, although import quotas and depression would still take their toll. By this time, the European market's efforts to slow down Hollywood, it was too late. The Hollywood producers were able to produce their films at home again, and studios was transformed into huge dubbing centers. So they were dubbing these films now, meaning you have one track that has the voice on it, and that one vocal track can be translated into several different languages. Sound not only changed the film, but also the film's presentation and its relationship to the viewer. In fact, the roots of silent film culture had to be demolished to give room to the rise of talking pictures. The elimination of the cinema orchestra was the first of all social tragedy. In the 1920s, the cinema had become the world's largest employer of musicians. Thousands of musicians were sacked, while many vaudeville artists lost an all-important source of employment. The luxurious movie theaters maintained a reduced orchestra and a sideshow with live entertainment. The wiring of cinema for sound also affected the competition between movie houses. A luxurious theater could take advantage of the innovation since the conversions led to important savings. So these conversions to sound led to savings, and that savings translated into them taking advantage of other technologies. Talking pictures made it possible to offer the same show in every cinema on Earth. This, leveling the differences, would undermine the old theater hierarchy and increase the competition in exhibition. In all countries, film critics, particularly the advocates of film as art, had great difficulties in accepting the new technology and integrating it in its aesthetic views. Thus, this reaction is understandable, though paradoxical. Sound had increased the autonomy of the film by banning local influences on the presentation, thereby contributing to the idea of film as an autonomous art. Moving on. Your adjustments in the studio. So the introduction of sound marked a period of experimentation, as well as in modern films, as well as classical films. Formal experiments could be found in Europe, particularly in the avant-garde movement. The avant-gardists edited sounds like images, creating aural worlds in parallel to visual worlds. It was a special feature of their films, these avant-garde films, an equivalence of all sounds. There was no hierarchical relationship between the music, voices, noises, and silences, as is usually the case in narrative sound film. So in Europe, they were messing with avant-garde, where you're just kind of layering sound as art, and it could be silent, it could be music, it could be a mixture of both, it could be anything. It's avant-garde. Whereas with America, we have this insatiable desire to consume narrative film now. So in narrative film, the dialogue takes a higher place in the hierarchy of sound. The art of writing dialogue was new to the film and had to be imported from the stage. More than ever before, talented playwrights were employed in the film industry. The spoken word did not only enhance verbal communications in the screenplay, but an actor received a voice that would help determine his character. So now you have the voice of the character, and they have to employ writers to write this voice. Okay, now that was the introduction of sound. Moving on, page 220, the studio years, the triumph of the studio system. The 1920s had been a decade of tremendous growth and prosperity for the American motion picture industry, and all phases of production, distribution, and exhibition expanded rapidly as moviegoing became the nation's and indeed much of the world's preferred form of entertainment. So in around 1927, 1928 became the talkies boom, and this marked the end of the silent film. The Depression caught up with the movie industry in 1931. And the Depression hit the big five integrated studios especially hard because of the massive debt on their theater chains. They had to pay that. They had to pay the mortgage. So Warner Brothers was the only one who survived by siphoning off roughly 1/4 of its assets. Okay, there were three major Hollywood studios: Columbia, Universal, and United Artists, or UA as it was known, that fared better in the 1930s. These companies, they focused on nationwide and overseas distribution operations, and they fared better than others because they did not own theaters. They didn't have to take on the financial burden of mortgages. So that what was a tremendous disadvantage in the 1920s, right, pre-depression, now becomes an advantage in the Depression in the 1930s. So at this time, let's see, Sam Goldwyn and other major independent producers like Joe Shinnick, they limited their output to about a dozen A-list movies or A-class pictures per year. So they were putting about a dozen movies a year, roughly one a month. But now we have the rise of this other class of film, the B movie, right? And this is a direct response of the Depression. Okay, so the B movie was scarcely confined to the poverty row outfits, but in fact became an important element in the studio system at large. All of the integrated majors produced B movies during the 1930s, with up to half of the output of Warner, RKO, and Fox falling into that category. While most of the major studios' revenues came from A-class features, the production of B movies enabled them to keep their studio operations running smoothly and their contract personnel working regularly. So you have the second class, the B movie that they're making. They're cranking these out, and it gives them an extra revenue. So now America is looking at what's called the double feature, where you get the A class movie and then you get a B class movie shown together. The federal government, in the meantime, during the Depression, had started an economic recovery program and enabled Hollywood powers to solidify their control of the industry. Hollywood evolved from an open shop type of model to a unionized town in the 1930s. And there was this division of specialization. So all the little specialty shops were divided now, as opposed to under one sort of moniker. And this was now mandated by government and codified by the various unions and guilds that these unions be formed in the 1930s. Beyond the government-mandated regulations of the industry in the 1930s saw increasingly heavy regulation of movie content by the MPPDA. In 1930, the MPPDA president, Will Hayes, authorized the drafting of the Production Code, a doctrine of ethics designed, according to its preamble, to safeguard the larger moral responsibility of motion pictures. Okay, this is the early studio years. Moving on, I'm on page 222, sorry. In the middle of the page. As studios grew in size, they became managerial, which is to say they rationalized and organized operations into autonomous departments headed by professional managers. So they started compartmentalizing the various aspects of production. And then those various aspects of a production had its own manager now. Most of the executives appointed during the 1930s who successfully managed the studios had backgrounds in either distribution or exhibition management of control. The management of actual filmmaking operations was invariably left to the salaried executives with direct production experience. So they're really fine-tuning managing these huge studios now. Moving on to page 227. The primary studio product was still the featured film, of course, which accounted for over 90% of the $150 million invested in Hollywood film productions in 1939. And they were still making A-class and B-class movies. And it depended on their resources, how much they hold, the general marketing strategies and whatnot. The A-class film has still remained the most crucial commodity in the classical Hollywood studio structure. Because it was the star, it was the star vehicle. Okay. Into the 1940s, the approach of war. The MGM's 1939, I'm on page 229 at the bottom. MGM's output contributed heavily to what many critics and film historians consider Hollywood's greatest year ever, a view underscored by Oscar contenders for the Best Picture of the Year. In 1939, Mr. Smith Goes to War, The Wizard of Oz, Stagecoach, Dark Victory, Love Affair, Goodbye, Mr. Chips, Of Mice and Men, Wuthering Heights, and Gone with the Wind. The view of 1939 as Hollywood's peak year was reinforced in quite another way by the industry's rapid transformation and decline in the 1940s, a decade-long process that began in 1940. One, during the odd and tense interval between the Depression and America's entry into the Second World War. The war in Europe introduced the U.S. government to the initiative to initiate a massive military and defense buildup, which had tremendous impact on the movie industry. While the buildup promised an eventual boost in Hollywood's domestic market, the short-term effects were primarily negative. Excuse me. The government financed its defense buildup by tax increases. And these tax increases impacted the film industry extremely hard. But by 1941, Hollywood and the nation pretty much had shifted into a more pronounced pre-war mode. The axis of aggression had solidified, and the U.S. support of Great Britain rendered a U.S. intervention against Germany and Japan all but inevitable. At this time, Hollywood steps up its production and includes features with clear interventionist and preparedness themes, and the public was clearly buying it. So they had this success of the war genre, or these new war genre film, and it was very successful. And they were mandated by the government that they had to make some war genre films. The growing power of independent filmmakers and top contract talent in the early 1940s was reinforced by the concurrent rise of the talent guilds, the Screen Actors Guilds, and the Screen Directors Guilds, and the Screenwriters Guilds. The top talent guilds represented yet another serious challenge to studio controls, particularly in terms of filmmakers' authority over the work. So, in the late 1941, in late 1941, the studio control of production faced a serious challenge. And it was termed to be the end of Hollywood's lush and prolific period. So this is what was facing them at the time, at the turn of this at this period. The studio system saw modifications during the war as the unit production trend continued, and A-class films output was increased to accommodate the overheated first-run market. So the big five studios at this point were concentrating on bigger productions, bigger A-list films. The studios readily adapted to the changing societal conditions, developing two government mandated genres that they developed. The home front melodrama and a new crop of wartime stars. The combat film and the home front melodrama. So those are the two genres that the government, the two film genres that the government mandated they make. And this brought up a new crop of stars, most notably Bob Hope, Betty Grable, Greer Garson, Abbott and Costello, and Humphrey Bogart. So all these traditional genres were all converted to the wartime effort. All right, I'm going to end it there, and I will see you on the next week's video.